the Forest School podcast with Lewis Ames and Gemma Southerden.
We're here with Chris today, and we're going to be talking about gender and lots of stuff to do with that. And so, can we start off by Chris? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you work?
Sure. Yep. So my name is Chris Begeny. I am currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter in the Department of Psychology. By training, I'm a social psychologist. I do a lot of quantitative research and some teaching as well, including on gender-related topics. I work on a variety of research projects that primarily focus on the experiences of individuals who belong to historically disadvantaged or marginalized social groups. So everything from women to trans individuals to sexual minorities to racial and ethnic minorities, and sort of how their experiences in life affect how they see themselves, how they affect their behaviors, as well as their mental health. So rates of anxiety and depression and things like that. So,
how long have you been doing that?
Let's see, so 2011, it's now been nearly a decade that I've been doing that stuff.
Do you think maybe, I don't want to say social standing, has the prevalence of what you are researching changed, presumably, in like a decade?
Yeah, some of the topics have, for sure. So some of the interest in the experiences of trans individuals, for example, has definitely gone up in recent years. I think the focus on not just, so traditionally, if you think about the experiences of individuals in disadvantaged groups, so say racial and ethnic minorities, traditionally people have really thought about like what are their experiences when they're around white people or other sort of non-in-group members. But in more recent years, and actually what my research tends to focus on, is minority individuals' experiences with members of their own minority group and how that affects all sorts of things, including their mental health and their experiences with discrimination, etc. So that focus on, intra-group experiences, I think, has started to sort of come up in prominence. Don't know about status exactly, but it's definitely gaining popularity.
Yeah. I was going to say awareness is definitely. I don't know whether this is my own bubble, but I feel like it's been a decade of awareness kind of going up and up, and maybe that's just because I've gone from being in my early 20s to nearly 30 now, and so my experience has changed, and my bubble has changed. But definitely the last 6 months, there feels like there's been some stuff going on in the world and going, actually, this isn't what we want to do, and
Yep, definitely.
We actually recorded a podcast with just the two of us about a year ago now, maybe even longer. We were sitting in the woods and waffling on, as we often do on a Friday, and we decided to talk about like our own experience of gender working in outdoor learning forest school. And we waffled on for a while, and then afterwards we were like, okay, this is definitely an issue we want to talk about, but we waffled with only our own personal experiences and making quite a lot of generalisations where we were kind of going, well,
that's what happens when you only talk about one experience. I've only got one narrative. I've got my narrative to talk about, and so when you talk about a thing that happens, it's hard to talk about it without it also seeming like, and this is the way that everyone experienced it. You know what I mean? You just end up.
So we kind of binned that podcast, didn't we? Where we definitely wanted to speak about our own experience, but we were really happy to have you along to also talk about how that may correlate or not correlate with like the projects that you've been doing. And one of your projects you mentioned is about gender in the workplace and career. Is that right? And is something about women in the workplace and how their gender has affected their self-esteem, and am I on the right lines with that? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I guess I could tell you about a few sort of related lines of research. One of them is looking at women's and men's experiences of sort of feeling like imposters in the workplace, right? So feeling like they're really like a fraud. They have a lot of self-doubt and insecurity about the self and that sort of thing. And so one of the projects we've been working on is thinking about the external and sort of contextual factors that lead one to feel like an imposter, which actually goes against a lot of, I think, both lay narrative and also sort of like academic narrative, if you will, about imposter feeling. So the fact that we call it an imposter syndrome suggests that it's something internal to the individual, right? I am an imposter or not. And the way that we then go about thinking about how to, quote unquote, treat one's imposter syndrome is as if we need to treat the individual.
That's really interesting.
Right?
Like it's a problem that you've got, like an illness, you're suffering. So,
Right. And so we sort of call bullshit on that and say, no, actually, people come to see themselves the way that other people treat them. Yeah. So when people treat you like you don't belong in that environment, right? Because perhaps you're, sort of a marginalized group in, say, or a woman in a traditionally male-dominated field, of course you're going to tend to cast more doubt on your own abilities, your own competence, your own belonging, your own fit within that environment. But the research that we're doing shows that when people treat you in ways that affirm your value and your competence and worth in that domain, you don't feel like an imposter anymore, right? And so even people who, prior to us doing any sort of quote-unquote interventions or manipulations on their self-concept, they label themselves as imposters, right? We can then offer a very subtle and pretty brief intervention, and those imposter feelings disappear.
That's amazing. Right? Can you give us an example of what kind of intervention you might suggest?
Yeah, so essentially one of the ways that we've been doing this, and I think there are a lot of things I think I like about this type of intervention, but essentially where you just have people reflect on instances where other people have come to them for advice or guidance on, say, work-related issues. So, a group of people at work are trying to troubleshoot some sort of problem, and they happen to seek you out, whether it's in person or via email, and say, hey, what are your thoughts on this? Do you have any input? Do you have any advice, right? And what I like about that is it's a way of pretty subtly communicating, or maybe not so subtly, communicating the fact that you have certain values, qualities, insights, skills, knowledge that are not just internal to you, but that other people recognize and value and appreciate. And that's the key piece, we think, is that when other people acknowledge those things inside of you, it changes how you see yourself. So it doesn't have to be so explicit as somebody coming to you and saying, I really value the knowledge and insights and skills that you have, but just coming and seeking those out. I think the other thing that's interesting about that intervention is that arguably, and from a clinical psychological perspective, traditional people who do research on imposter feelings might actually think if you go to somebody and say, hey, we want you to we're calling upon you to share your insights and your knowledge, etc., somebody who traditionally feels like an imposter might actually sort of panic inside, and that might actually facilitate larger and stronger imposter feelings. But it doesn't seem to be the case in any of the research that we've done. You actually can turn off people's imposter feelings, through these types of things. So
I definitely think that hearing you sort of describe that thing, and I think for me one of the things was doing this was when I first started running toddler groups. I'd been a teacher, I had a really good background in education, and I had done loads of research in child development and everything, but I wasn't a parent.
Yeah.
And I definitely felt a change doing toddler groups even when people just knew I was a parent. So my kids did sometimes come to toddler groups, but even before they started coming, when it was just like, he's got a kid now, I felt more people, maybe I felt like I could join in with more conversations about things that beforehand felt slightly uncomfortable, because call a spade, toddler groups, mostly mums, and so there's already a gender difference between a group of 5 or 6 mums coming with their kids and a male instructor on his own. But then once I was a parent, it felt like I was then more in that. There was more of a Venn diagram circle overlappy thing. And I could join in on conversations about, how are they sleeping through the night, or how are they, and then you start to go kind of like, oh, okay, and that's just spiraled. The longer I've been a parent. And
do you think, so the kind of interventions that you're describing, would you say in those interventions where you're kind of asking people to reflect on times where they have been singled out as valuable and or whatever, do you kind of, I don't know how to phrase this really, but in that kind of intervention and that way of looking at things, are you essentially kind of going, well, gender is out the window right now, that's not important, we're not talking about your gender, we're just talking about your value as a human. or sometimes does gender come into it in terms of, the reason I'm asking this is because we have discussions quite often about like being a woman in the world of kind of bushcrafty, outdoor, adventure ed, and being a male in the world of kind of childcare, as Lewis is just describing. Yeah. But then we also quite talk about how gender kind of works in our favour a lot of the time. And so does that ever come up as a thing where, you know, being in a minority group, so being a male in a mostly female environment or vice versa, might sometimes be of benefit to that person in that situation, even if they feel like an imposter? You might go, well, okay, well, maybe a female perspective on this is valuable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I think it's sort of a tricky line to walk, I think. So in some ways, I think that's absolutely the case, that you can be valued and appreciated for the things that you might sort of bring to the group as a function of your gender or your class or your religion or whatever it might be, right? But there's also the potential that it can sort of backfire if it makes it seem like an issue of tokenism, where like the only thing others see you as is as a woman or is as something, especially if they're saying, you know, oh, you're a woman, so I assume you're going to have insights about something stereotypically feminine or some stereotypically feminine topic.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that in some of the early research we did on this, where it was actually some qualitative research looking at people's experiences of feeling valued or not feeling valued, that sort of thing, we found that there were instances where actually people were feeling devalued in the workplace when people would come to them for advice and insights on things that had nothing to do with the workplace. So I remember one where, you know, a woman was seen as very sort of fit and athletic and a really good runner, and so people would come to her and ask her for advice about that, but she was working in a STEM field where that had nothing to do with it, and so it felt as though, from her perspective, that almost she was being sort of, her actual work-related skills and insights were being neglected, right? So I think the importance is that, you know, whatever people are coming to you for has to not make it feel like you're a stereotypical token based on some group membership of yours, and
you're not an ambassador. You're not.
Right. And that's a shitty position to be in, to have to like be the representative of some
and that's happened a lot recently, hasn't it? Like Dizzy Rascal on GMTV, and they asked him about, so what do you think about Black Lives Matter? And it's like, what? So I'm now the black spokesperson for all blacks in the UK. Like, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about a new album, whatever. And then they didn't really let it lie. They were like, oh no, come on, Dizzy, like talk about it. And I thought that was such an interesting conversation to happen on live morning telly in front of everybody. It's like,
well, that's not his work, is it? That's not what he's doing.
It's like the next step of awareness. So we were talking about awareness, weren't we, just a minute ago? And so, you know, why people might become more aware of Black Lives Matter. But then the next step is not going, oh, okay, well, let's listen to every black person's opinion about, you know, in terms of...
Ask them what we should be doing. Put that onus on everyone we know of colour or of gender diversity, and go, you teach me now. It's your job.
You go and do the work. It's your.
I know you've got all this other shit going on you've got to deal with. Also, could you make me feel better? Could you?
Right. You know, some of the other work sort of also related to gender in particular in the workplace. Oh, I should say about the imposter stuff, actually. A few decades ago, it seemed as if some of the evidence was suggesting that women tended to feel like imposters more often than men in a variety of different environments. More recently, research suggests that's not the case, that there isn't a very clear systematic gender difference in the tendency to feel like an imposter. And in fact, the research that we do shows that you can sort of turn off those imposter feelings with both men and women. So just as an aside. So some of the other research we've been doing, and actually this is led by a colleague of mine, Loes Musen in Belgium, who does some work looking at women's and men's expectations of success in the workplace, and the implications that has for their willingness to make sacrifices for their career. You know, sort of like sort of give less time to other parts of their life in order to really sort of put their career on some particularly strong, you know, sort of trajectory. And what her research finds is that essentially when people experience discrimination in the workplace, or they're sort of underrepresented in certain work domains, their expectations that they'll succeed, even if they make those sacrifices, is much lower. And as a consequence, they're just less likely to make those sacrifices. So it's a pretty rational thing when you think about it. Like, even if I work my ass off, people are not gonna sort of give me those opportunities.
Why play the game?
Right? So what's the point? And so I think the important thing that research shows is that we often sort of think about these differences, say, in representation of men and women in different professions, and we think, well, that's maybe, men are highly represented in certain fields because women just don't want to be in high status positions in those fields, or they don't want to, work as hard or put in the ambition or whatever it might take to really thrive. But in reality, it's just a function of the opportunities that are presented in front of you.
Yeah.
Right?
So you might even interview a woman and say, well, why didn't you make that sacrifice? And they might even say in their own words, well, I didn't want to sacrifice my family. But actually, that's not from a fair baseline.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And that must trickle into education. That must trickle down into particularly early adulthood, where you're going, if you're already seeing that you are being sidelined, might be an extreme term, but if you're already experiencing those things, and you're then being told, right, you've got to really knuckle down for your exams, you've got to, how early are you going to switch off and just go, why? Because I'm not going to get a fair shot.
Yeah, and people don't perceive that you ought to be given a fair shot, maybe because they perceive that you're just not as capable. So there's some interesting research showing that, I think this is in very early childhood education. I don't remember what grades exactly, but I want to say kids around the age of 9 or 10 were in a math classroom, and the research focused on asking the teacher, how much do you think each of these students of yours is going to struggle in this sort of advanced math class, or just a math class, I can't remember now. And basically the teachers tended to say, oh, the girls in my class, they're really going to struggle a lot more than the boys, even when they were statistically controlling for how well those boys and girls were doing on tests, their class, their, all sorts of things. So even when you're looking at a boy and a girl who are matched in every single way, people's expectations of them are quite different.
And then that affects even subconsciously how you interact with that person, how you do. There was a bit in I can't remember the name of his book now, but I was reading Arcala's. He's like a black activist, and his book is half what's the experience of black individuals in the UK and half his own sort of narrative and going through. And he was saying that irrespective of class, gender, attainment, that we have a Key Stage 2 thing where the teachers put predicted grades in when the kids are 11, and teachers on average, when you factor in all those things, put black and Caribbean students 2 points lower than they will averagely attain, but they put Indian and Asian students 2 points higher than they will average it. And you might go, well, that's just a teacher assessment, the kid can come in and prove that wrong. But if you've already got that's already existed, that you're already looking at them as going, well, I think they'll achieve a C. You don't want to go well, you're being a misogynist, you're being a racist, you're being whatever. But it kind of is, isn't it?
Yeah, and you wonder where where is it's like chicken and egg, isn't it? It's like, where does that initially start? And how do you stop it?
Yeah, right. And where it starts, I think, speaking to both of...
Tell us, Chris, fix the world. Fix the world for us.
Well, all I can say about this is that even, I think, dating back to the 1970s, there's this interesting research where researchers went into a classroom and they gave this ostensible sort of competence assessment test to all the students in the class, right? Which didn't actually... It served no purpose, but basically just giving the teacher the impression that students were being evaluated on their competence, right? But then what the researchers did is, regardless of how students did on those scores, they randomly assigned certain students to say, just so you know, these students, they're probably going to really thrive and excel. And these other students randomly assigned, regardless of how competent they actually were, to say, they're probably not going to do so well.
Wow, the ethics of this study is quite interesting.
1970s, right? And by the end of the year, those had become a true self-fulfilled prophecy, which is to suggest that the teachers are inadvertently, I don't think maliciously, treating students in subtly different ways. And I think those subtle differences come down to, for example, if you see in your head a certain student as saying, they're going to struggle, they're not going to thrive. When you ask a question as a teacher and they put up their hand and they answer, sort of a question that's or they answer in a way that's sort of half right, half wrong, how much do you facilitate that answer, right? How much do you say, sort of, but if we think about it this way, versus saying, does anybody else have something to say about this, right? How much do you actually engage that student and really try to foster that knowledge in them? Right?
I think that is one of the things that's when I think about our practice and how things like this relate to us, and I think it's because we operate, I would say, closer to what early years might be considered to operate in the UK is much more, will you show me and I'll write it down, rather than once you get into primary and secondary education, it's like, I'll tell you and you write it down.
Yeah, and jump through this hoop, and so I can tick you off.
But when you just, when our day is such, it's almost like because our the input we're doing is so light touch that we've got the opportunity to just go like, oh, okay, you did that in your play. It wasn't me going, well, you guys get these shovels and you guys get this thread and you guys do the, you just kind of go, it is all open to you, and you build a much more individualistic relationship with each person of going, oh, okay, but there's two sides to it, isn't it? Because you can go, everything here is open, but also to everyone, there's nothing, we've got no like gendered toilets or anything, so there's no way of going, this is for you and this is for you. But children exist, and social peer pressure exists, and so sometimes we have gone, I'm gonna proffer this to this person because I think this social setting might not be letting them explore this thing, so I just want to give them an opportunity to just go, do you actually want to do this thing? I'm going to engage it, and I'm going to ask you if you want to chop wood first. It's
a little bit like that diagram that's been doing the rounds about equality. Have you seen that with the that kind of thing? So you might kind of go out of your way, as you say, to kind of encourage,
just to check in, though, isn't it? It's not to go, you must do wood chopping now, which you might get in a more formal education setting. You might go, look, we've got this initiative and we've been given this grant money, and so we're going to pick these students because they fit a certain description and we're going to make them do X. And but it's just to kind of go, do you want to, this is open, do you want to do this, do you want to get involved?
That's going back slightly to what you're saying about like teacher expectations of children in a classroom. I've just reminded me of like I was teaching in secondary and teaching English and drama, and drama I would liken much more to forest school, so it's very practical, very hands-on, much more child-led. It's all about like devising and imagination and see what you come up with, and that's cool, you've done some things and I've looked at it, great. As opposed to, you must pass this exam with this grade. Sometimes. But I would sometimes teach the same students in both subjects, and so see the difference in that. And forest school is kind of similar to drama, so you might drop into a primary school setting and deliver a forest school session, but the teacher is there and they've got these preconceptions of the students based on their behaviour in the classroom, their performance in the classroom, and you don't have any of that, and you just come in, here's a group of human beings outside doing some practical stuff and doing some talking. And how those kind of roles can shift. And it's really interesting, and I would definitely have experience of kind of meeting a child in a practical lesson like drama and kind of go, oh, cool, they're really interesting because of X, Y, Z, and then meet them in English and look at their writing and go, oh, oh, right. And it's so, that's one of the reasons I left teaching, because you're just that kind of top down of like, you have to follow this path and jump through the hoop, and if you can't write with full stops, then sorry, dude, I'm going to try and help you as much as I can, but you're not in my little group of aiming for C or above, because you can't even write full stops yet, even though you're 13. So your judgment shifts, and you'll go, why am I? It's awful, really bad.
And it's one of those things, I imagine, there's nothing, sort of malicious or intentional in sort of how this occurs among teachers, but perhaps in part as a function of like, you've got X number of students in front of you that you need to educate, and you can't give all of them sort of the individualized sort of experience that they need, and so inevitably some of them end up getting sort of tracked on sort of a secondary route where your expectations just inevitably mean they're never going to sort of come back up to the level where some other students
and the carrots and sticks are different. If this, I used to get where it was like, if the teacher before you has assessed child as able to achieve X, and they still only achieve X with you, you don't get chewed out. Do you know what I mean? If they're already on, let's say, the low achievement track, and they stay on that low achievement track, okay, nobody was expecting you to pull them pull it. Even that phrase is like that they're not capable. It's all that stuff, isn't it? That's and I think as you go through, particularly, I mean, you could probably speak to it more, Gemma, the secondary schooling, I think, is where, because you go through puberty, don't you? And so gender things become a bit more my experience, I would say primary school, early years has this thing where children experiment, in my experience, with being hyper male, hyper feminine. I'm going to only wear pink. I'm only going to play with dolls. I'm going to do whatever. Just because they're going, well, I've been labelled as a girl, and what does it mean to be a girl? I'm going to go to the extreme end of this spectrum and just see what it... And boys go, right, I'm only going to play with guns, and I'm going to do all the things that are perceived as masculine. And then 5 to 11, primary school age, I would say most stuff is kind of like... I used to teach girls that were better at football and enjoyed it more than the boys, and no one ever went, oh, she's a girl, she's playing. But you get into secondary and this stuff starts to come in, I would say.
Well, I was reading a thing in the paper at the weekend that said that A-level English is suffering a real crash in applications from boys. So it's becoming, they're calling it like a foreign language. So at the moment, like something like 3.6% of modern foreign language students at A-level are male, and 5% of English A-level students are male now. And it's like, why is this happening? I have some theories about why it's happening, but how that subject becomes gendered at that, So we talk a lot about girls and women in STEM subjects and what's being done there, but what is being done about those kind of typically, in inverted commas, feminine subjects like English? Like, why is it happening?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and there's so what I've heard of is what's now referred to as the HEED domain. So this is, I think, this is talking more about sort of professions and careers, not education specifically, but so it's like I forget what it stands for, household care or something like that, early education, and I want to say domestic something. Basically these domains where, it seems like they are predominantly sort of occupied by women, and men tend to feel that they're not allowed into those spaces either, much in the same way that you see the flip side of that in STEM professions and whatever else, right? And so, I don't know this research very well, but there is some stuff that compares sort of men's and women's experiences in, say, the English and humanities sort of sector versus science, technology, engineering, math, all that stuff. And you see, my understanding is sort of similar processes where men pick up all sorts of signals in the environment that suggest this is not a space for me. I don't see many other men. I don't see things that suggest this suits my stereotypical masculine qualities and whatever. And so they tend to opt out of that environment or are sort of nudged out of that environment in the same way that happens to women in a lot of STEM professions. So I think a lot of people talk about it in terms of this idea of there being sort of like a lack of fit, or this idea of ambient belonging. So it's this idea that there's cues in our environment everywhere that suggest who belongs in that space and who doesn't, right? So anyway.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because the environment can be such a big thing, because if I was stereotypically going, this goes in this box, this goes in that box, if you think cooking and meal prep, I think most people would say that is traditionally and seen as a feminine role, but cooking here and cooking outdoors becomes this different thing where you go,
totally.
oh wait, if there's an actual fire involved, then man must cook.
Like barbecue,
man must cook.
Barbecue cooking is male.
That's right. And head chefs as well tend to be men, right? So there's
a financial side or a status thing
I wondered
there, along
with
studying English. I was thinking about what you're describing about obviously the ambient, the clues about gender there, but I wonder as well whether there's an element of men still being seen as the typical breadwinners of a family and looking for those jobs that are going to provide that level of status, security, financial income. At the moment, our society does not pay great sums of money to people who have done English as a degree and gone into that kind of world. So there's that other...
That's right. And to me, that speaks to a really important point, which is that there may be, as you're saying, male-occupied domains or traditionally male-occupied domains and traditionally female-occupied domains where the other gender, if we're talking about gender in these sort of simple binary terms, as not fitting or belonging or whatever, but that is not to draw an equivalence between those, because they often sit at different sort of levels of status and hierarchy within society, right? In terms of how much you're paid and all of that stuff. I'm really just repeating the things that you have said.
Well, it's that difference, isn't it, between being a very good home cook is viewed very differently to being a head chef at a restaurant. But they're exactly the same skill, but we view them differently. Have you done any work? I know you said that some of it is looking at the trans community. Do things like that, gender roles in terms of the workplace and education and what's expected of people. Is that something that trans people have to navigate sort of doubly, or?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm certainly not going to be in a place to sort of speak to this in a way that is like, I don't know, maybe valuable at all. But what I can say is that it does seem to be the case that trans individuals have a whole other set of sort of barriers and unique obstacles to sort of endure and encounter from childhood on through adulthood. And even in certain contexts where, so for example, if we talk about the LGBT community, oftentimes that sort of acronym seems to lump lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans individuals into a single category, but in fact there are lots of spaces and domains where trans individuals are not accepted or valued in the same way that maybe gay men are, right? And so that sort of speaks maybe roughly to this idea that there are unique barriers that trans individuals face, coming from all sides, you know what I mean? Coming from cis individuals, coming from sexual minorities, all sorts of individuals.
I kind of steamrolled slightly over a point you were making about forest school environments and like cooking, for example. And I was just thinking about sort of drawing on the research that you might have done and kind of workplaces, educational places and that kind of thing, and looking at the forest and going, if you could have a kind of, as far as possible, non-gendered, because wherever you are, as you said, there's ambient cues, there are things in your environment which are going to place kind of signals about what's expected, what's encouraged, all that kind of thing. And I was wondering how kind of non-gendered the forest can be as a setting for people to be in, to exist, to take part in activities. And I'm just trying to remember what it's like to be in the classroom and think, well, certainly there is, from my personal perspective, it's less of a gendered environment. It's going to always be gendered, isn't it? You can't kind of get away from it. You can't get away from society. It's not like you kind of walk through the gate into the woods and go, all of the stuff that we've been doing.
This is one of the interesting things, though, isn't it? Is that the forest school is not just the environment, it's also the group that comes into it. So as much as, we could go, we're going to completely make this, and it is, there's, I would say, very little evidence of anything being gendered here, but you bring in 15 kids and all of them have got experiences and all of them have got gender biases, and so when they play with each other, that's what you bring to the group. You can go, right, well, the shovels aren't gendered, but if only the boys go and pick up the shovels initially, then it's not us making any sort of cue, but the group has made a cue. And even coming into this environment, how often are kids in TV shows or books seeing girls versus boys play with saws or play with hammers or these things that sometimes are seen as stereotypically masculine? And so, I think inevitably there are sort of, gender stereotypical cues just about in any environment. Not to mention, I think the forest tends to be a space, like, especially if you think about it in sort of an outdoorsy, adventurous sort of space, it can be sort of a stereotypically men's space, right? But I think, as you're saying, it's in part what kids come into and bring to it, and also I'm sure what the two of you are doing with it, right? And the fact that the two of you are here, and I can only imagine, Gemma, you are engaging in lots of stereotypically masculine qualities like starting fires and all of those things can help change those perceptions for kids. And we do sometimes do that. It is sometimes something we do intentionally or not intentionally, where if we have a group, it might even be a parent and child group, and even sometimes then it's more important because you go, not only have you got the children's, you've got all these adults coming in, and we'll have a conversation and go, well, actually, can you go and do the fires, because I think this family and this family are getting a bit of a thing, or they're seeing me in this way, or they're seeing you in this way, so actually I'm going to go and do the cooking, or I'm going to go do some weaving with those kids, and there's almost like a joy in throwing a spanner in the wrench and just going I'm going to go do this thing. You challenge me if you want.
And there's also a thing about our working relationship. So only kind of, I guess, in the 4 years now we're working together, only in the last year or so, I would say, have I personally felt comfortable enough to kind of talk about any insecurities I might have about working in a kind of male sort of perceived world. So I don't think we've spoken about this before necessarily, but like
God, are you leaving?
using like power tools, for example, right? So I'm down with like using a handsaw, a hand drill, all of those kind of like traditional old-fashioned woodworking tools. Yeah. I'm kind of down with that. I don't have that kind of like anxiety of this is not my world. Yeah. Whereas I know a lot of people would, male or female. But when it comes to power tools, even though in many ways they are actually easier to use, safer to use, less scary, there are less like really kind of sharp blades that if you slip, because you're just pressing a button, that's all you're really doing, and require less strength. So really, it should be the other way around. If anything, it should be like, okay, well, naturally, physically, unfortunately, I'm not as strong as Lewis, so I'm going to go with the power tool option as opposed to doing it by hand. But I will naturally go to the hand tool, and there's times when Lewis has gone, I can see your thought process, and you go, hang on, no, you're going to do it. And I'm really glad that you've done that.
I would say sometimes people will almost poo-poo any talking about. So like, if I am talking to, well, I had it actually, I was talking to somebody about something being racist or something, needing to be anti-racist or moving forward. And, there is an element of, I'm a white cisgendered man, and they were almost using that to go, well, I'm not going to listen to anything you say about this now. And I was going, but I want to make this better, and I think I am making this better.
Yeah.
But and then you get into this, it's almost imposter syndrome the other way. Of am I allowed to better what I hope is bettering the world?
Yeah.
Do my conversations.
Don't have a right to have a say, I guess.
Right. And I do think there's a delicate balance there between, so we talked earlier about not wanting to put the burden of sort of correcting the issue on those who are at the bottom of that burden, the ones who are oppressed. And so that would suggest, we should, as cisgender, heterosexual men and white men, whatever, we should be making efforts to sort of like step in and that sort of thing, right? But not in such a way that
because we can fix this
at the expense of and not from a place of entitlement certainly, and not from a place of taking up the space of others, but in sometimes often just sort of trying to create space for others to sort of take it or not. You know what I mean?
So voices from your position of privilege.
In the context of like you sort of like giving Gemma a nudge. Do you want to use the power tool? You know what I mean? You're not like forcibly saying no, I know better, you need to use this right now, but sort of trying to offer a little more space there.
I think that is one of the things as well that I found, because our ethos is long-term and relationship building. There's lots of things that you might, a lot of gender norms and things like that are based on a first impression and quite often a visual impression. And I know what I look like, right? I for people that are listening, I've got a shaved head, a big beard, and I'm covered in tattoos. I'm not someone that stereotypically a toddler will look at and go, that's a person of safety.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And and I feel like acknowledging that has been important for me to go, I'm not going to just overstep the mark and be like, you can sometimes talk to children in their first or second session in a different way than I can, because I know that, your daughter comes to our sessions, I would imagine by now she pretty much sees me and Gemma on a level playing field. But there is a thing for a lot of children where they go, okay, I'm more comfortable talking to Gemma, or I'm more comfortable talking to Lewis, but kind of acknowledging what you're bringing to the table when you meet that thing is kind of important.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you got to sort of meet kids where they are with whatever sort of ideas and impressions they have about, how different people of different genders and different races, sort of occupy spaces and what skills they have and that sort of thing. At the same time, you try to, over time, as you say, in sort of the long term, you sort of nudge those or try to sort of shape those in other ways. And I think that's what's so cool about this for schools. It seems like there's lots of opportunities that both of you are taking to offer sort of counter-stereotypical examples, right? And I think, you could offer nothing but counter-stereotypical examples at every turn, and kids will still get 10 times more stereotypical shit from the TV that they're watching and the books that they're reading and their own peers and, if not their parents and teachers and every other space in life, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so it can be really, really good. I think it's, hats off to
we
both
do
of you.
We do slightly push the kids. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes they will ask me to do something even though Gemma is stood, or vice versa, one of us will be stood next to them, just doing some observing and looking around, and they might walk 100 meters over to find me and go, can you cut this stick? And I go, yeah, Gemma's there. I'll be busy doing something else, and they'll just go like, I'm gonna. And it's trying to pick apart. Was that something because is that something relationship-wise they felt more comfortable talking to me, they just wanted to have a chat with me,
right.
Or have they gone, there's a bloke with it,
it's an interesting kind of scenario where it kind of feels a bit like a family while we're here, like as in a heterosexual kind of cisgendered family, and those kind of traditional roles that come along with that. So often and the longer kids are with us, the more that kind of feels like that, and in lots of ways it's incredibly positive, and you've got like that kind of really cozy feeling where everything's kind of okay. But sometimes it kind of spills over into, I just get like the amount of times I get called mum recently. Have you noticed? Mum,
but that's also
Nanny,
to do with,
I mean, Gemma, and I love it. It's fine. It shows. It's a signal to me that kids are comfortable, and it's great. But the other day, do you remember when it was like we'd all eaten something together, and it was like, oh. No, it wasn't. It was they wanted to cook, but they didn't actually want to cook, so they were just like, "Oh, Gemma will just cook it for me." And I was like, "Hey, Lewis." Hey, Lewis. A bit like how I was called out back in the day. I was like, "Hey, have you noticed that these people just want me to like cook their meals for them?"
It was a nice bit of theatre for you. You stood up very loudly.
Oh, this is kind of interesting. And I didn't actually use like I'm being the mum. It was more like, oh, they want me to kind of be a servant right now and do everything for them. This is kind of, I wonder how I should approach this. Should I say yes because that's kind, or should I go, do you know what? I don't really feel like running around after all of you guys and like cooking you a full meal right now. And that definitely felt like a bit of a, I don't think they would have done that to you. I don't think they would have, to me it felt like a kind of, oh yeah, mum will tidy my room. Oh yeah, mum will do this. And I was just like, you guys, I get this at home. I don't really want it in the workplace right now as well.
Yeah, and they get it at home too, right?
Yeah,
and that would,
exactly.
Yeah,
completely.
They get it at home, I guess.
Yeah. There's I don't know if you've read a book called It's Okay Not to Share. Have you read that? Oh, I think you'd like it. I find it interesting.
Radical rules for children.
It's Renegade Parenting. Who's it by? We talk about it all the time. Anyway, in there's an interesting bit about. So it's lots of examples about things that kids might do or behaviours you might see where normal society might go, well, that's wrong, stop doing that. Yeah. And she is kind of taking another perspective and going, but why? Why is it wrong? Surely this is just okay to let them play through this and explore it. And one of the things she talks about is very gendered play, where, give an example that's very relevant to Forest School, a group of children, a group of girls make a den, and then a boy comes over and goes, hey, what are you doing? And they go, we're building a den, but it's no boys allowed. This is a girls' den, and we are not letting you in. And so a traditional adult educator's reaction to that might be to sit down and go, okay, that's not fair. Explain, share. And she takes a kind of alternative view of it and goes, okay, these children are exploring their gender, they're exploring
but like you were saying at the start, what's it like to be in a group of peers who share this thing?
And we're just going to experiment with that and see how it feels. And so her perspective is to go, okay, do you know what? You have made a girls' den. Here is some paper and a pen. If you want to, you can write a girls only sign. You can write no boys allowed. You can really take that to the full extent and see how that feels, which is a kind of interesting view on things. And
they do. She does say though that by writing it, you can then amend it. So if you've got a sign that says no girls, one of the options she says you can put it, because if it becomes persistent, then that's when it's not quite okay. If it's a one-time play thing and we're just exploring this, but if it becomes habitual week on week, that's when she starts saying, well, actually, what is your sign actually saying? Just Sophie, Molly, and Daisy? Because that's a different way of saying actually. You don't just want girls to play because you're not saying these girls can come in.
But we've talked about this a lot, haven't we? Because it's one of the most kind of controversial bits, because we've kind of flipped it and gone, okay, so let's put it another way. A group of white children are making a den for the white children, and no black people are allowed in the den. How do you address? And it's very, it's a topic.
It's the balance between how do you explore your own identity and the groups that you fit into without being exclusionary and those kinds of things, you know?
Yeah, right. So I'll see if I can make the connection here with a thought I'm having, or maybe it'll just sound completely separate. But to me, it sort of speaks to this idea of, to the extent to which, say, teachers or, you know, facilitators, however you want to sort of think about those people within that environment who are maybe adults, whatever, are the extent to which they're actively versus passively sort of letting kids think about gender and explore gender. Or maybe you can almost think about it in phases where, like, you know, there's a time where the facilitator is rather passive. They can build the no girls sign, but then after a while you might try to step in and do some facilitating to think more about what that means and the implications, whatever else. And so what it reminds me of actually is some research, some like just awesome research that I love by some developmental psychologists who essentially had two classrooms, and in one classroom teachers were instructed to use gender labels, and not in a way to say, oh, okay, now we're going to do this activity and it's going to be boys against girls, right? Not like a competitive thing, but just simply using the labels in a rather passive way, right? So saying, okay, boys and girls, good morning, how are all of you, right? And seeing how that affects kids' understanding of gender over time. Right? And so it was a rather passive way of sort of introducing gender and signaling to kids that gender matters. Like, this is an important category by which, you know, people are labeled, et cetera, et cetera. And what they found is that over a few weeks span, at the sort of before they did this sort of intervention, if you will, or this manipulation, they had all their students in each of these classes say, you know, how much do you enjoy engaging all of these different types of activities? And they would rate them, and some were stereotypically masculine, stereotypically feminine. They would say, you know, of all these other students, your peers in the class, how much do you enjoy playing with those different students, right? And looking at how much they want to play with boys and girls. And also, they would actually have research assistants go out to the playground and watch how much time kids were spending playing with kids of the same versus opposite gender. Again, talking about gender in a very binary way here. And what they found is that in that classroom where you just say, good morning, boys and girls, 2 weeks later, those kids' attitudes toward their opposite gender peers had changed to become more negative. Their attitudes toward playing with counter-stereotypical activities or toys or that sort of thing also became more negative. And then on the playground, they started making in-group networks. Girls started playing more with girls, boys started playing more with boys. None of this was happening in the classroom where gender was not being made salient. Right? And so to me, this speaks to the fact that, like, teachers, parents, whomever, even just by passively sort of letting gender be a thing that's important in the environment, kids are actively engaging with that on their own. And so if you don't say anything about it, they're going to do something with it, and they're going to pick up cues and meaning from it wherever they can, and that's going to be shitty television shows and shitty books that are nothing but stereotype-laden crap, right? And so to me,
don't sugarcoat it, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going at it here. Sorry, podcast listeners. But to me, yeah, it sort of speaks to the fact that you need to have some level of active engagement in offering counter-stereotypical examples and that sort of thing. There's a developmental psychologist named Rebecca Bigler who I think just does awesome work, and they would say that when, I hope I'm representing Rebecca Bigler here correctly now, but they would sort of say with kids who are at such a young age, they don't seem to be expressing any sort of gender stereotypes. You don't necessarily need to sort of talk the talk with them and sort of like, oh, look, this girl is working with a hammer. But you do need to show examples in their environment of girls working with hammers, but you don't have to label it as such, right? So you have to sort of walk the walk, but you don't need to talk the talk, if you will. However, when kids start expressing those things themselves, you need to say something about it explicitly. Okay. So that's when you need to not only walk the walk, but you need to start talking the talk.
And when you say you need to, is in order to change
to address,
you need,
sort of these stereotypical conceptions, right?
That may be damaging,
right?
Because that's the other thing. So we've talked about this chapter in this book a lot because it's contentious and this kind of thing. So you might say that there's kind of associations with gender that kind of come up naturally and are part of life and are part of exploring who you are.
Right.
And then there's associations with gender that are potentially damaging, limiting, exclusionary, all those kind of things. And I guess it's about the adult kind of looking at the difference there. So if a child of any gender wants to play in a very stereotypically gendered way, it's not for us to come in and go, hey, stop that, that's not allowed, or
right.
you sure you should be doing that, or to question it. But it's when it kind of steps into where you think it may have a negative impact either on themselves
animosity?
or other people. I don't know, it's kind of a fine line.
It is, and it's a tough thing, and to me an important question there is like, you know, and in some ways it can be an impossible question to answer completely, but to me it's important to think like, well, where is that student or that kid's motivation to do that activity coming from? You know what I mean? Is it some truly intrinsic thing that they're just exploring, or is it a reflection of the fact that they've been told in all sorts of other environments that this is what they're supposed to do? And exploring those spaces and exploring, you know, the types of clothes you wear and the colors that you like and all of that stuff, I think is great. And you shouldn't sort of be like, no, you girl can't do anything except stereotypically masculine stuff. But there has to be some space for that to happen.
Can I try? I think I can. You'd probably correct me, because I'm going to try and tie together two things that we talked about. Because when quite often people talk about sort of gender, but also race, and they will say that actually there's an argument I think that people might use to say it's important to talk to children about race because they're going to face certain scenarios or things because of it. And so to pretend that it doesn't exist at all could in some ways be detrimental in a different way. But if we tie it together with what you were saying at the start about imposter syndrome and that being an external thing, is there an element of saying that actually if you could you know, go through to early adulthood with no, let's say, gender, no mention of gender at all, that you wouldn't ever feel an imposter syndrome because you wouldn't ever have interpreted that you shouldn't be doing a thing that you should be doing? Or are you doing a disservice because suddenly you'd hit the ground and you'd go, well, why are you treating me differently? I don't understand this thing about gender.
I see.
You know?
So like if they were in like a sort of like a-gendered environment for a long time, but then came to a point where, I don't know, they started going to
you might emigrate
education.
or something. You know,
right.
Something like that.
I think that can be tough. And as a parent of a young child, it's something that I am actively trying to sort of explore and understand. You know, for example, there's sort of these certain developmental milestones where, you know, researchers have found that kids as early as like 10 months start making some pretty clear sort of understandings of gender associations, and usually by at least 36 months kids are making sort of labels for themselves and others, like, oh, that's a boy, that's a girl, I'm a girl.
What sort of things do they... Is this the thing we were talking before about?
Yeah. So all sorts of things, whether they're, you know, they can just identify based on somebody's physical features, whether it's their hair or their body shape or whatever. They can say, oh, that's a boy or that's a girl, and that sort of thing. But also all sorts of other stereotypical associations they pick up at a young age. Everything from associating hammers with men or boys to certain textures, like thinking of hardness as a male thing and softness as a female thing, right? So even at a very, very young age, I think they, you know, are sort of picking up.
And do they know where that comes from? That hardness is, you know...
I can't imagine. I can't imagine, you know, that they've figured that out. But in some ways, I guess it speaks to the fact that, like, the idea of making an a-gendered environment is probably, you know, a lost cause in many ways.
Do you think that will change as maybe if I look at particularly sort of Western history has been very gendered for quite a long time, and I would say we're possibly at a point of some sort of gender renaissance, enlightenment. Gender roles are not, you know, because the workforce is no longer man go build with bricks, lady stay at home.
Do you think?
No, maybe not to the extent that it once was. It's harder to see, or maybe it's shifting because, you know, particularly. You know, everybody's gone home and we've been in our houses, and lots of children will have seen their parents working in ways that they might not have. and this just might be my own bias, but I would say it's possibly harder to associate like something that's a static desk job, that, you know, my wife does a static desk job, and somebody's dad could do a static desk job. As I'm saying it, I'm like, well, no, because computers and technology are kind of male closed-door things. But do you know what I mean? They're less physically attributed to a male. You know, men are stronger, and so they must do the manual labour and the digging and the mining. If it's like, well, that's a computer, it's harder to argue, perhaps, that couldn't be done by anyone of any gender.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess, you know, something that comes to mind is, for example, in earlier years of education, including sort of secondary school and high school, both men and women, boys and girls, are, you know, sort of exceeding and doing well at sort of equal levels, and are roughly equally represented in a lot of stereotypically masculine domains, whether that's, you know, the hard sciences, physics, or, you know, technology, engineering sorts of things, right? But if you look at that trajectory over the life course, as you get into sort of the career stage and that sort of thing, women are dropping out far more than men. And even in higher education, women start to drop out more than men. And to me, that suggests like there's something there. There's some sort of change where there's capacity and potential to sort of rectify some of these like gender imbalances in certain areas and domains. But there seem to be still quite a few barriers in the way that ultimately eventually lead to many of the same sort of gender disparities we have seen for a long, long time.
Yeah, is there much kind of research or kind of examples of either workplaces or fields that have taken a kind of anti-sexist approach? Because I'm just thinking about it in terms of, I mean, there's lots of debate, isn't there, about whether or not you should have kind of, you know, promote a minority in a particular field past the majority. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've got a job vacancy, women are underrepresented, so I'm just going to offer this job to a woman, even if there's a guy who's better, and all the kind of debate around that.
Toe that line into tokenist, you know.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about, like, inevitably the fact that women bear children is going to affect workplace kind of representation, isn't it? So dropping out either because you are pregnant or you have a child, or you want to look after that child, you want to breastfeed that child, or you think you might do that at some point. So your expectations of success are different, because you think, well, okay, I'm not going to be able to make it to CEO or whatever because I'm going to want kids at some point, so I won't even try even now, even though I might not want kids for another 10 years. And I wondered, I mean, apart from things like you know, breastfeeding friendly workplaces and things like that, and allowances and stuff, I wondered if you knew of any kind of things where workplaces or fields are kind of promoting women. And so it's something that comes to mind, and I think this will sort of answer your question, but in sort of a roundabout way, which is not necessarily to, I mean, there's things you can do to sort of facilitate the careers of women, say, around motherhood and childcare and whatever, but also changing the norms and expectations about the roles that men will play in child rearing, right? So there's pregnancy, of course, but then there's everything that comes after pregnancy. And so, for example, implementing not just voluntary care leave or parental leave, but mandatory parental leave, right? So that men also have to be taking off the same number of months as women. And so in some ways that enables you to sort of balance out those career trajectories in certain ways, right? In certain ways. Now there's of course going to be all sorts of other more subtle barriers that are going to get in the way, right? Like women are asked about, like, oh, well, do you think you're going to try to become a mother in the next, you know, year or two? Or even
and
not
men
even
never
asked,
get
it's
that
just assumed,
sort of,
especially if you're in a very female sector. So if you're in an English department teaching in a school, you know, I've listened to those conversations around recruitment where it's like, well, do we really want another woman in this department who's going to go on maternity leave? Probably all about the same time, which happens. Like, and you can't deny it and go, oh, it may not happen. It probably will, but you need to make up for that in some way rather than not.
Well, wouldn't it be nice if the same conversation was, well, you know, we know that this, you know, person of fatherhood age is going to also be taking X number of months off to, you know, do child caring responsibilities.
I was told that was why when I was doing my PGCE, my teacher training, one of the lecturers specifically said you will be more highly thought of in an interview because they know you're not going to go off pregnant. They know you're not going to leave if I think they might have even said like leave if your partner changes job or something to that level. And they were basically saying that if I wanted to, I could be the head teacher of a primary school in 5 to 7 years, which at 20 is insane to think that just because of my gender that and they were like, they were saying, look, primary schools are underrepresented, and it's almost that thing of they're going, look, men are underrepresented in primary school, so they'll be desperate to get you in. And I was like, okay, cool, I'll use that to my advantage. And they were like, and they'll see you as, because they want someone to do the authority and the discipline and the behaviour management. And I only taught for 2 years, but I would say I was definitely nudged in that direction. I was the only male member of staff in a team of 10 to 15 teachers, and I remember so I'd only been teaching, must have been my first half term, and I had fuck all idea what I was doing. They just go here's 30 kids, and then an older child knocked at my door and said, oh, Mrs. sent me in here, and I went, what? And he'd been mucking around in that class, and so she'd sent him to me, the least experienced member of staff, just because. And then I kind of went, okay, I didn't know what to do. I went, cool, sit at the back, we're doing this, and I got him to join in, whatever. And then I saw that teacher, must have been the following break or lunchtime, and she went, thanks for taking so and so, he really needed a chewing out, or he needed a whatever. And I was like, oh fuck, I didn't do that. I was quite friendly to him. Just that, nobody said, are you happy to have a kid, or are you gonna do this thing? And it was very weird just to see that, like you say, the external thing. And then by the end of the 2 years, I was priding myself on behaviour management. I was like, look, I can get any class in line quite quickly, I'm really good at this thing, I can do short, sharp shocks of I've got a big voice and I've got a scary face and I can do these things. And the longer I've been doing this, the more I've been like, oh god, I really regret that. And look back at it in this weird.
Well, and it's sort of those things, right? Like, so it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're sort of put in a position where you're like maybe feeling a little bit outside your britches, and we're sure if you could but you figured your shit out, right? And could a woman have figured her shit out too in that same situation? Hell yeah, probably. I would assume, if they're given the opportunity, right? But there's and so it reminds me a bit of this thing called a motherhood penalty, which is when colleagues or managers find out that you are a mother or an expecting mother or whatever, they start to see you not just as less valuable, but they see you as less competent. They're going to pay you less, all sorts of things, right? On top of a motherhood penalty, you have a fatherhood bonus, which is to say, when you find out that a man is going to be a father, now you're not only all the positive stereotypical masculine qualities, but you're also caring and nurturing and all of these things, and so people pay you more. You know what I mean?
Wow.
That's so true. When I went on maternity leave with my first child, I was teaching secondary school. I've been very happy. It was my dream job. Brilliant. Fit me down to the ground. All boys school, so very interesting to be a woman in that environment. Female head teacher at the time, and then I went on maternity leave. Head changed to a male head. I actually really respected him. It's a great head teacher, and I had been promised that when I went back, my job would be the same, but more. It'd be better because I get A-level experience. So I'm teaching older children, more responsibility, more of an expert role, and then, oh no, sorry, no, you can't do that anymore. And of course, never explicitly said, because you are now part-time, you're now a mother, or the rest of it, exactly as you're describing. It's like, you are no longer seen as competent to be doing that role. Holy moly, I went insane. And was literally raging. I was like, I need to get out of this place, I need a new job, and I need it now, and this is terrible. And then inevitably you don't leave, because you need that place. It's going to give you a part-time job, and you settle. You settle, but you've got this rage inside that you didn't have before. And it went from being my absolute soul feeding employment to just this. I'm just literally doing it through gritted teeth because
well, and if I don't know, if you want to put more icing on top of that cake, there's also something called backlash effects, which is essentially where it's most often studied in the context of women who are acting in stereotypically masculine ways. So, for example, if you had sort of responded to that situation by being like, you know what, I'm gonna get to those A levels, and I'm gonna show that I'm really competent and I'm really assertive, and tell that head teacher, no, I can do this. There can actually be backlash that comes toward you for acting super assertive and independent and autonomous, because as a woman, you're not supposed to be acting in those ways. Yeah. So then you're seen as a bitch, right?
Totally, yeah.
And so, yeah, so it's just like, you know, not only is it a fine line often that women have to walk, but that fine line is being sort of twisted and moved and shaken, and so it can be impossible sometimes to sort of walk that, you know?
Yeah, and then you suffer for it.
Support the podcast today by becoming a Patreon member at childrenoftheforest.com. Check out the podcast links for more details.
I wanted to talk about sort of, you spoke a while ago about, do we think that times are changing and there's more kind of acceptance and things like that, and about creating an environment in which is inclusive for young people in terms of gender, and also freedom to kind of explore gender, perhaps. So if you've got a young person who is thinking about their gender and maybe experimenting a bit, or seeing themselves as non-binary, and do you have any kind of studies about like environments that are sort of enabling in that way, or like inclusive, things like that?
Yeah, both some of the research that I, with colleagues at the University of Exeter, have done, and that others have done as well, suggest that, like, hell yeah, parents and teachers need to be gender affirming in whatever their kids are exploring, right? So if kids are like, I think, I want to start going by the name Max or the name Mary or whatever it might be like, awesome, I'm going to call you Max, I'm going to call you Mary, whatever it is, right? And in those sorts of environments, kids have lower rates of depression, lower rates of anxiety, and as a background to this, trans kids and trans adults as well, rates of suicide attempts and suicide ideation are just through the fucking roof. And so we need to do what we can to make gender affirming environments. And so, just sort of all those ways that you can sort of affirm whatever gender they're exploring, I think is awesome. I also, with some some experiences within my own family, I have noticed that sometimes when parents have a child who seems to be exploring their gender, often from a well-intentioned place, they almost want to sort of say, oh, no, you're a girl, and that's what you are, and they don't want them to explore gender because they're afraid of how other kids are going to treat them, that they're going to become the target of all sorts of stigma and discrimination. And while I can completely understand that...
It's like a protective urge.
Yeah, right? On two levels, I see that as problematic. One, because you're not enabling your kid to explore their gender, and I fundamentally think that it's good and healthy for kids to explore it. Like, I mean, shit, if kids are going to spend their time, exploring different types of music and different types of, whatever they explore, and different types of games and videos and whatever, why not their gender as well? Hell yeah, check that stuff out and think about it. But also because then you're fucking reinforcing the status quo over and over and over again. And I understand that it's because you're worried about your own child's experience, and that's important, but I think rather than trying to change your kid or thwart your kid's own development in terms of their gender, think about how you can change that environment around them, right? How you can sort of talk with teachers or supervisors within that environment, that sort of thing.
And sometimes I'd imagine that can come from a place of like, if you have grown up and you almost know the system, and so you're not just seeing, okay, you might get picked on at school or whatever, but you're going, okay, if you go down this path, I can see this barrier for you, I can see this barrier for you, and I might be able to talk to your teacher, but I can't change X banking company. And not to say you shouldn't do it, because that's the only way that things move forward, but I can completely empathise with the feeling of going, I don't want your life to be, it sounds stupid to go, you don't want it to be harder than it has to be, but it will be harder if they're not comfortable in their gender, and they're spending their whole time going, yes, nobody treated me differently today, but I hate myself.
That's right.
It's really tricky.
It is. It's a tough thing. Yeah, it is a very, very tough thing, and I totally get wanting to sort of give your child the best that you can, but this idea of sort of shielding them, I don't.
And I was reading. I think I've talked to you about it on a different time. The ABCs of LGBT, and it's been really good because it's very short. I'll put a link to it in the podcast things, but it's very short descriptions, and there's lots of words in there, and just part of it is just me opening my eyes to like, there's this massive spectrum, constellation, color chart thing, and all these words, and having words that go with them. And so if somebody wants to use those words, I go, okay, it's a shortcut. I know more about you and those things. But they're also talking about things that people might say that would be damaging when children and young people start expressing stuff. Like the example was someone who's trans or non-cisgendered, that we go, they identify as, but another child you would go, well, they are a girl.
Yeah, right.
And just that turn of phrase, we don't say to someone that conforms to how we think, you identify. I don't go, I identify as, I do now, I try and say it more often.
Right.
And things like sexual identity, where they go, well, are you really bi if you haven't had a relationship with a person of X gender, or all these words like gender flux, and I was learning about spike, which is this thing where some people say that they have romantic feelings, but they vary day to day. So there'd be hetero something flux, and they go, but that means that some days I find men very attractive, and I might go a month where I just go, nah, men aren't a thing for me. And so I think that can also be one of the things that puts people off engaging with it, because you crack the door a little bit and there's this entire world behind it that it's almost easier to go, no, boys and girls.
Right.
I'm going to keep that door shut.
These conversations are so interesting, and inevitably there are going to be these kind of backlashes and arguments and things, and it's a bit like the kind of the gradual increase in awareness of gender issues, sexual identity, all the rest of it is amazing on one hand, but you're going to get even our generation, right, that we're kind of the kids that are growing up now. I often think about how our kids are growing up in a world in the UK where gay marriage is legal. That is going to have a huge impact on it, because you find yourself, because those questions come up all the time about marriage and family life with young children, and to be able to say openly, well, you are allowed to marry whoever you love, you are allowed to marry a man or a woman, you can marry whoever you want, whereas those conversations, within our own lifetimes, we never grew up that way. These kids are going to be kind of streets ahead of us in terms of acceptance, you would hope, and awareness and everything else. As they have the freedom to express those preferences or those gender identities, we are the ones learning from them in a way, aren't we? And we're the ones kind of going, oh, okay, what do I, as you say, what do I need to know in order to, because everything that you're showing me is legal, allowed, and and you're being told that. But our preconceptions are the only thing that's kind of gonna stop you being able to fulfill your sexual preferences.
This is one of my lifelong or life-filling fears, is that at some point, I'm just gonna almost fall off the bandwagon of trying to continue to think about things in different ways, or try to explore, diversity in all sorts of ways, and I'm gonna get sort of stuck in my old ways, and my siblings or my kids or whomever are just gonna be like, look at that old fart and his old ways.
He only thinks there's 9 genders.
So hopefully it can be a lifelong endeavor, but it's true that it's a sort of a thing where I think people want simple boxes. Naturally, we make sense of the world by categorizing things, and that's a lot easier when, for example, in the context of gender, there's only 2 boxes, right? And that's it. And
it's shortcuts, isn't it? I heard somebody the other day say that we are we're lazy thinkers. When there's a shortcut, our brains will take it. So whether that's a shortcut in terms of you just eat the red things, or you do that, and so if you can make a quicker, and that's why stereotypes and racism kind of works in our brains. It not works, it taps into something in your brain, because it goes, do you know what, you can compartmentalize that. You don't have to engage fully with this, because don't worry, this person's like this and this person's like this, and whatever else. And so it is a stretch sometimes, isn't it? And particularly, like you say, some people that are of an older generation, physically they are less able to make brain connections. So to try and introduce something, it can be
Yeah. Oh,
you
yeah,
know?
sure. Yeah, if those things have been reinforced for 50, 60, 70 years, yeah, those ideas can be hard to break. And it's true, right, that we are cognitive misers. We're going to take the path of least resistance in understanding the world around us. It takes an active and deliberative extra step to question those things, right? And we all have those heuristics, those shortcuts built into us. And yeah, people have to find the motivation as well as the capacity to engage with those things and question them and think critically about them. When people, for example, are under a cognitive load, right? When they've got a lot of shit on their mind, it's harder for them to take that second step of like questioning whether or not they're evaluating somebody based on gender stereotypes, for example, right? So we've got to think about how we can create environments where people are not just motivated to take that extra step to critically question themselves, but also have the cognitive resources to do so. They have the space to do so.
That's interesting. So in Forest School, a key part of the ethos is to be reflective as a practitioner and as a group. So you might build reflection into each session that you have with a group, but also afterwards. So instead of planning in a kind of traditional education way, you might kind of go, okay, well, I need to cover section 3 of the curriculum, so that's how I'm going to do my planning.
Yeah.
Forest School planning will be based on reflection, either yourself if you're working alone or with your fellow practitioner, and to reflect on what you saw, not just in terms of like the skills, but the behaviour, the attitudes,
social, emotional,
the mood, all of that kind of stuff, the weather, the environment. So it's completely holistic in terms of the way you're reflecting, and to probably document that in whatever way is good for you. There's no set way of like you have to fill in this form, but so we use like an app where we record our
just
reflections.
Brain dump. This is all
and
the
we've got
stuff.
headings for different days and different groups and that kind of thing, and then that would lead into our planning in terms of like, okay, well, we noticed this with this person or this group, that means we're going to maybe offer this as a thing, or either as a kind of opportunity or as a measure to put in place to make someone happier or to fulfill their potential, whatever. But some people do use quite like forms, don't they? And there are some examples available online and in the community. And I was just wondering, as you're kind of talking about that and like making space for it, whether kind of gender issues should be, I mean, I'm sure there's a better word than gender issues, but could be a kind of almost compartment within that reflection in terms of what you're offering, in terms of gender stereotypes. Did I promote sort of equality?
Absolutely. I think that would be amazing.
That'd be
amazing. Yeah, and especially I'd be curious to know the fact that you take the time to do that more thorough reflection, do you think that's because you've built in sort of the space to do it, which is to say some people might not, because they just have to cram through all these things they have to get through, etc. Is it part like a motivation thing because you see the value in it, or so to me the question is what do we need to do to make more people sort of engage in that
We've
sort of
talked about
activity?
this before, definitely with teachers. So in other countries, teachers are given more off timetable time to plan, to mark, to reflect. And we've talked about this before, haven't we, in terms of that kind of holistic reflection is not part of teacher training, of expectations of teachers. It may literally be, in fact...
We get, so I would say UK training focuses on the curriculum delivery, and it focuses on safeguarding. So we obviously have all the stuff of, what do you do if you see signs of extremism? What do you see if you see signs of abuse and things like that? But it's almost like until you get to that point, social emotional stuff doesn't matter. You can be sad, but you tick this box and now we're going to pay attention.
Social and emotional learning aspects of learning, SEAL. Did you ever have SEAL?
Yeah.
In your teacher?
Yeah.
So that's kind of gone now. So there used to be a thing where so the government were always kind of tweaking the curriculum and going, okay, well, we've got to address social and emotional aspects of learning, or personal, social and health education or whatever in some way. Do we make that a discrete subject in which we talk about like sex, relationships, mental health, all that kind of stuff, or do we sprinkle it throughout the curriculum in every lesson? And so when I started, it was the latter, and it was a planning part of your curriculum. So as a department, when you were going, okay, so what book are we going to study if it's English, or what are we going to do, what topic are we going to do this term, and how are we going to put in social and emotional aspects of learning through this curriculum, which kind of made sense to me, but there wasn't really a reflective part of that. And it's almost like it isn't really your place, as you say, until
it became,
it gets
when I
to
was
the level
teaching,
of...
it became here's the curriculum. The school had subscribed to it's called like Laughter and Smiles, and it's got week by week, year by year. You just open the book and you go, oh, okay, it's September, week 4. We are doing police in the community. Great. Regardless of, has someone had an experience with the police? Has someone, is there actually some real big gender stuff going on that they could really do? But no, it says week 4, we got to do this thing.
And you weren't really encouraged to get to know the children. I don't know, you're probably different in primary maybe, but it wouldn't really be my place as somebody's English teacher to notice perhaps some issues around gender and some upset there. It would almost be frowned upon if I made reflections about that and discussed it with other colleagues. It's like, that's kind of not your business, that's not your place, whereas in fact, it is everybody's business.
Applications for Forest School training are now open at childrenoftheforest.com. Check out the podcast links for more details.
And it's occurring to me as we're talking that sometimes people might reflect but not know what the next step is. You can reflect back on it and go, do you know what, there's loads of gender, you might just look at it and go, there's loads of gender stuff going on in this group. Are we okay with that? Especially if you're reflecting on your own, you might talk to a spouse about it, you might talk to somebody else in the school, but really it falls on you. But just knowing, you as you said about the imposter syndrome and how many times people ask you, and to be able to go, oh, do you know what, I'm going to make a concerted effort to ask that child for some help with X tomorrow, in the next session. That's massive. And if you can but it's stuff like that if we hadn't had this conversation, I would never have
realised
got to that point and gone, okay, actually what I need to do is to boost self-esteem in X, or boost her, or even just you go, okay, one of the things we could be doing is building in reflection of who asked you for help today, or who have you helped, so that people can, at the end of the session, the kids can reflect back on and go, I helped that person do X, so that they're taking it away with them. And like you say, not everybody who does forest school or works with children is privy to the research that you're doing, so trying to share it and go, okay, these are some, that's really practical. You can just put it in.
Something I've meant to, have you read The Confidence Code? It's like it's a book about confidence for women. I'm halfway through the audio book of it. I haven't really made up my mind about it yet, but at the moment they're still at the kind of phase of defining what confidence is, and also talking about studies that have been done, and like your example about the maths kind of group that you're talking about in primary school, they're talking about older students and saying that 50-50 male-female students taking a maths test and like interviewing them beforehand about their expectations of how well they're going to do, and women generally say, I'm going to fail, and the guys are like, I'm going to ace this, and then they kind of tweaked the variables within that study, and one of the things they did was after. So it's a question, like between the questions they would pause, and then a tutor would go around and say to the women, on that question there, you've just done really well on that question. That actually affected their performance in the next question, even though they were all equal ability when they went in. But on the women, the input from another person going, just that affirmation. And so we talk a lot about Alfie Cohn and praise and that kind of thing, and that's another icky area where I'm like, on the whole I kind of agree with it. On the other hand, like how do you define praise, and how do you define like affirmation and confidence giving and boosting, especially when somebody is lagging behind others, whether it be because of gender expectations or whatever, which can be another kind of input there, or just just an awareness of like, you did that. Remember when you did that thing.
Absolutely.
This is the end of the first half of the interview with Chris, but we come back for more gender-related issues in Chris Begeny podcast part 2.
Ladies and gentlemen.
If you like this podcast and want to support more episodes, you can donate through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Children of the Forest to show your support for the Forest School podcast.